How you guys doing today? My name is Anthony Ganji, host of Tier Talk, and I want to talk about an officer's subjective perspective when they're involved in a shooting. It's very important that we discuss this because, unfortunately, right now the officer's perspective seems to be either minimized or negated, and I want to try to remind people of why that perspective is so important, because you can't understand what's going on during an officer-involved shooting without the officer's perspective, because that's part of the context of understanding what the situation is. Now, again, Tier Talk's the only show on air for corrections. Today we're going to talk a little bit about police, and you can follow us on multiple venues: iHeartRadio, TuneIn, Spreaker.com, Player FM, Stitcher Radio. Also, don't forget I have my new YouTube channel, so follow us on the YouTube channel, subscribe to the show. This way you get the notifications every time we go live, and also download the app. It's a free app. You can get it on Samsung and Apple devices, and also soon we're going to be on that Manhattan Neighborhood Network, which is available to all five boroughs of all five boroughs of New York, as well as streaming it live from their website. And also I have a Tier Talk Facebook page, so please follow the page. I recently did a show with Lieutenant Dalton Price and Michael Wolfert from Justifiable Force, and we discussed the officer's perspective during an officer-involved shooting, and we realized a lot that day. We realized that officers are just not being heard. And the problem is, without the officer's perspective, there is no context to the situation. But there's more to it than that. Not even just about the officer not being heard, but also when we deal with the officer going through the situation, the officer is not also being given that respect. And what I mean by that, when an officer gives a directive, especially during the heat of the moment, those directives should be heard and should be listened to. You should be listening to what the officer is providing. He's providing directives so he can eliminate the threat and therefore create a better interaction with the person that they're dealing with. But until that person listens to the directives, in the officer's mind, that threat still exists. Now, back in the day, officer came on the scene, the uniform and the badge, that was like the initial shield. You came onto that scene and people respected that. You gave a directive, people respected that directive. Now, officers are being challenged a lot more. You see it every day in the news. Today we had an officer that was killed in Missouri. How many officers get killed responding to a domestic call or just simple vehicle stops? The respect for officers, it's gone. They don't respect the uniform no more, and they sure as hell don't respect the badge. And when officers go onto the scene, actually, instead of respect, you just see a target. And the people that are shooting the officers or shooting at the officers kind of feel justified because of what the public feels. Every time you get some twist from the media about what law enforcement really is, the public then, adds to that mix because they believe what the media is saying. And then people, when they shoot at law enforcement, they kind of feel that their action is justified, and it makes it tough for the officer to maintain the scene if they don't know the threat, the people that they're dealing with right now. And again, if people feel justified, it's like a motivator. If I'm justified for shooting at a police officer, it motivates me, especially if the public believes that we're wrong, especially if the public takes the negative actions of one and generalizes it as a way to define anyone that wears the uniform, which is not the case. It's not the case. That's a very bad stereotype, because there's going to be a lot of professionals that do their job correctly, and they're going to get killed because, again, of the negative image that's been pushed by the media and the public kind of agreeing with that image. Again, that's why it's ultimate. It's our responsibility to make sure that people respect the people that wear that uniform. And if there is a problem with one person that wears the uniform, then we need to hold that person responsible and separate that person from the uniform. Because again, the other professionals that come in with the intent to protect and serve, they're going to get hurt. They're going to get hurt because they've been generalized to the actions of the one. That's something that we need to stop immediately. That's automatic. That's part of the discussion I had with Lieutenant Dalton Price and Michael Wolfert. And guys, use of force is never going to be pretty. Michael Wolfert taught me that. Use of force is never going to be pretty. Public is never going to really understand use of force. We can train them. We can do what we can to try to bridge that gap of understanding. But in the long run, unless you live and breathe that moment, you're never going to truly understand what was going on in that officer's mind. But the least we can do is ask that officer, though, why was that person a threat to you? Maybe it was because you tried to give multiple directives and the person chose not to listen, and therefore you could not control the scene. And when you cannot control the scene, you have that universal precaution. Everybody has a weapon. If I'm being called to the scene to protect and serve, and I'm being told in my mind that there's a suspect who fits this description who may be carrying a weapon, and I see somebody who fits that description, and I approach that individual, and that individual chooses not to listen, I'm going to treat that person as if that person has a weapon, because I don't know. And for me, that threat still exists. That's the problem. And that's what the public just doesn't seem to understand. Sorry guys, I gotta do a switch. The public doesn't understand that until we can control the scene, the threat still remains in the environment. And what you need to do is you need to ask the officer, when they're involved in a shooting, what happened? Why did you feel that that person was still a threat? Was it because they continuously to ignore your directives? Which, by the way, when the officer shot, the officer's reacting. Why don't we go back and ask the other side, why did that person not listen? Why did that person not listen? Because that officer is trying to give the directives so he can save both lives. I'm telling you what to do so I don't have to shoot you. But if you choose not to listen to me, I have a right to go home too. I have a right to live my life. So again, we have this all backwards right now. Our most important thing that we need to understand is that the officers that are involved in the OIS, they're reacting. They're not the aggressors. And we're treating them like they're the aggressors. When people choose to ignore the directives that they provide, that's the officer's attempt to save lives. But if that person chooses not to listen, then the officer is being forced to act. And by the way, we shoot to stop, not to kill, but we are trained to shoot center mass. Center mass. We're trained to shoot center mass because that's the most likelihood that that's going to stop the aggressor, but also it's the biggest target. We shoot that biggest target so it's less likely for us to miss and hit somebody else because we're responsible for every bullet. And we don't have to employ lesser lethal levels of force. We don't have to employ lesser lethal levels of force because they're not guaranteed to stop someone. If someone's coming at me with a weapon, I have a right to stop that individual immediately. What people got to start wondering is, why did I react? Ask the officers, why did they react? Because they are reacting. Why did you react in that fashion? That's the key. Stop putting the blame on the officers when they're being called to the scene and being put in situations in which they're forced to defend themselves. But remember, they came in with the intent to protect and serve. How come we're not asking them how they feel when they have to take a life? Because that's not what they want to do. They join the force to protect and serve. How come we're not asking them when they have to take a life, how do they feel? They took a life. It wasn't their intent. We should be worrying about these individuals. As always, the show is Anthony Ganji, host of Tier Talk. It's frustrating. But I just want people to know that the officers that do their job respectfully and professionally, before we make judgment, we should ask them why they made the choices they made before we cast judgment. Something as simple as that can easily bridge the gap. And the public, I know you want to be able to see the videos, you want to see what's going on, you want that transparency, but you have to be educated. You have to try to get the perspective of the officers involved. That means that you're going to have to require training too. Because you're not going to be able to properly interpret the videos that you're going to be seeing unless you know what you're looking at. As always, guys, love you guys. Stay safe.